Now, I have a little confession to make, and that's that I'm not really a financial person by nature, or at least by background, but I came to realize that if we are to build a new economy, a more fair and just economy, then we have to tackle this issue. There's a tremendous amount of wealth and capital in this country, but very little of it is trickling down to the cooperatives and the Main Street businesses, the sustainable food and energy ventures, the minority and women-owned businesses. In fact, a lack of capital is the #1 thing that holds these companies back. So really what local investing is about tapping the capital that exists right here today in our own communities to support the enterprises that make them strong. So I usually do a little bit more of a preamble about why it's important to invest in local companies, but in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right into some stories from my book that I think make that point a little bit more eloquently. So the first story is about the cops in Clare, Michigan that saved their town's 111-year-old bakery and revitalized their downtown in the process. So one morning, Officer Greg Reinerson, and that's him on the right, was out on patrol when he heard some alarming news. The Clare City Bakery was going to close its doors for good. Well, not only was the bakery a fixture of his youth, but if it closed, it would be yet another empty storefront in downtown Clare, which, like many towns in Michigan, is really feeling the impact of the struggling auto industry. So back at headquarters over lunch, Reinerson convinced 8 officers, and that would be the entire Clare police force, to chip in and buy the bakery. So don't let those cherubic Midwestern faces fool you. These guys are very clever marketers. And the first thing they did was to rename the bakery Cops and Donuts. They also tweaked the menu, adding items like the Squealer, a maple glazed donut topped with 2 strips of bacon. And a line of merchandise with t-shirts, with slogans. Oops. Am I going the wrong way? Okay, we're not moving. I don't want to give away my punchline. Should I just do it manually? Drawing visitors from all over. And today, they've expanded into 2 adjacent storefronts, and they employ more people than the police and fire departments combined. And that success has spilled over to other merchants on Clare's Main Street. So instead of vacancies, new stores have opened up. But there's another way that the Cubs help their community. Like many local businesses, they buy as much as they can locally. So their flour is made from a family-run Michigan supplier, their coffee is roasted locally, and their t-shirts are made nearby. They also support local charities, and they sponsor a t-ball team called the Little Donut Holes. I actually have a picture of them, which I have to add. So this is a fun example, but I think it really demonstrates the importance of local ownership and this idea of the local multiplier effect. So locally owned companies spend more locally, they support other merchants, so they're spreading wealth and creating local prosperity. My next story comes from Port Townsend, Washington. This is about 40 miles north of Seattle. So several years ago, a group of people there, and they were young and old, wealthy and not, began making investments in local companies. So after the financial crisis, they decided they wanted to formalize this arrangement, and they created what they called a Local Investing Opportunities Network, or LION for short. So LION members are like angel investors or micro-lenders with a hyper-local focus. And they don't all invest as a group. Each one will negotiate his or her own deals, but all the businesses in the area know that they can come to this group when they need capital. So today, the LION has about 60 members, and they've made about $3 million in investments to a bike shop, an organic farm and cidery, and the Mount Townsend Creamery. If you've ever had their cheese, it's amazing. And these deals may seem small, but they've really had a big impact on the local economy. What I love best about this example is that, inspired by what the people of Port Townsend have done, other communities across the country have created LIONs of their own. So in Seattle, Portland, Oregon, Madison, Wisconsin, we have one in New York City, and then there are a bunch of others that don't call themselves LIONs. So my final story comes from Saranac Lake, New York, which is a little village in the Adirondack Mountains. Well, several years ago, Saranac Lake's only department store closed, and not because it wasn't doing well, but because the parent company took on too much debt and went bankrupt. It's a common tale in corporate America these days. So that left residents to drive an hour each way to get basic items that weren't readily available in town. Underwear happened to be a biggie. So at first, they tried to attract other retailers to the area, but the only one that was interested was Walmart, which wanted to put a super center in this beautiful area. Well, a lot of people feared a super center would overwhelm their small town and put their local merchants out of business. So they decided to create their own store, one that was owned by the community. So a group of residents put together a business plan, and they began selling shares in the store through what's known as a direct public offering, or a DPO. Whoops. So a DPO was sort of like a do-it-yourself IPO, conducted without the help or the hefty fees of a Wall Street bank. And because it was confined to residents of New York State, it was exempt from federal securities laws. Well, it took them a few years, but they raised more than $500,000, and a few years ago, a couple years ago actually, they opened the Saranac Lake Community Store. So I like to think of it as the retail equivalent of the Green Bay Packers, a department store that won't pick up a need when a better offer comes along, or when the parent company runs into trouble. So there are many of these stores now across the US, and really they're not all that different from a cooperative. And there's one more DPO example I wanted to mention, which happened after my book, but there's a company in Massachusetts called Real Pickles, and they make real pickles. But last year they raised $500,000 to finance a transition to a worker-owned cooperative. So these are just a few examples of how people are investing locally. But I want to point out that they all take place within the narrow openings of our current securities laws. So these laws were put into place in the 1930s. And they basically said that if you're wealthy, you can invest in anything you want. Private companies, venture capital, the sky's the limit. But if you're not wealthy, well, with very few exceptions, you are confined to investing in publicly traded companies. Now, the laws were very well intentioned, and they're meant to protect investors. And they actually worked very well, at least when the public markets were still truly an engine for growth. But these days, they prevent the majority of Americans from investing in the companies that they know and trust. My friend and fellow author Michael Schumann calls the system financial apartheid, and I think that's a good term. So this is why the Jobs Act is such a big deal. Does everyone know what that is? Okay. Short for Jumpstart Our Business Startups. It was signed into law in April 2012, and I was really honored to be one of the people in the Rose Garden before that signing ceremony right around the corner from here. And there was so much electricity in the air that day because this was the first major update to our securities laws in 80 years. And it basically brought them into the internet age and made it much easier for ordinary people to invest in private companies, locally owned companies. So before the Jobs Act, it was easier for Americans, most Americans, to invest in a company halfway around the world than one in their own backyard. So this is potentially a game changer for this local investing movement. I say potentially because the laws have not been fully implemented yet, so we have to wait and see. Now, the Jobs Act had a number of provisions, but the piece I'm really excited about is crowdfunding. Does everyone know what crowdfunding is? Okay. It's when you raise lots of small sums of money from lots of people over the internet. So it's kind of like the marriage of social media and finance. So the best known crowdfunding site is probably Kickstarter. It lets people donate money to creative projects like film or music or somebody's invention in return for rewards. So maybe you know, a film credit or a copy of a CD or simply a thank you. And in a very short time, Kickstarter has raised almost $1 billion for millions of people to fund more than 50,000 projects. And it's growing so fast, it's really hard to keep these stats updated. But the point here is that this is a major new funding channel that didn't even exist 4 years ago. And it's allowing tens of thousands of creative projects to come to life that might have never made it past the studios and the record labels and the industry gatekeepers. So projects like the Pebble Watch, you may have heard of this one. It's a watch that displays caller ID and email and other stuff from your smartphone. So the inventors of this watch were turned down by venture capitalist after venture capitalist. But on Kickstarter, they were able to raise $10 million from almost 69,000 people who thought it was a pretty neat idea and pre-ordered the watch. So today they've shipped all of those watches, and they've since gotten a $15 million investment from a VC firm. So I think the lesson here is that the crowd, or the community, can often pick a winner better than the experts. Okay, this is sticking again. I'm a math person, so. So that was crowdfunding 1.0, donations and rewards. So imagine Kickstarter, but instead of donating to a creative project, you're investing in a business or a cooperative. And it could be loans, or it could be equity, or it could be some kind of revenue sharing deal, but there's that promise of a financial return. So this is what the Jobs Act makes possible. Now, crowdfunding is not without risk. You can lose money, as you can with any investment, including the stock market. But the bigger concern has been fraud. Will the scam artists come out of the woodwork? And they'll probably try. But the Jobs Act includes some pretty good safeguards built in. And just very briefly, crowdfunding platforms have to register with the SEC. They have to hold the funds they raise in escrow, so they can't run off with the money. Companies raising money on these platforms have to disclose basic financial information, and there are limits as to how much individuals can invest and companies can raise in a given year. So the SEC is still finalizing the rules. So today, this kind of crowdfunding is only available to accredited investors. But I want to point out that this investment crowdfunding has been going on in the UK for 3 years with virtually zero fraud. And in fact, the British government recently put 60 million British pounds into crowdfunding platforms as a way to stimulate lending to small businesses. But the best way to mitigate risk, in my view, is to keep crowdfunding local or within a community where there's more intimate knowledge of the market and participants have social bonds and reputations that link them. So it's like Peter Lynch and Warren Buffett have long advised. It makes sense to invest in what you know. So these are just a few crowdfunding sites that are taking a more local approach. But today we have all kinds of very specialized crowdfunding platforms, and I thought I'd mention just a handful here that I think you might find really interesting. One of my favorites is based right here in Washington. They're called Fundrise, and they let ordinary people invest in local commercial real estate. So their idea was, why can't the people who live here, that are going to live in this building or work in it or walk by it every day, have a say in what gets built and, by the way, profit from it? So they're a really great site to check out. Mosaic is doing really well. It lets people invest in solar energy projects, which is an investment as little as $25. Spark is a new crowdfunding platform, also based here in Washington, that lets people invest in small and mid-sized energy efficiency projects. Crowdfiber, another new one based in Rome, Georgia, if anyone's from Georgia. And that brings together municipal governments with residents to fund gigabyte broadband networks. And finally, Microgenius is based in the UK, but this is a crowdfunding platform that specializes in raising money for cooperatives. So I don't think we have one like that here in the US, but maybe that's a good business opportunity for one of you entrepreneurs out there. So I want to briefly touch on interstate crowdfunding. As I said, while we're waiting for the SEC to finalize these rules for mainstream crowdfunding, they've released draft rules, and based on that, it looks like it's going to be pretty expensive and pretty cumbersome, so in many ways kind of unworkable. So in the meantime, states are sort of taking this opportunity to create their own crowdfunding laws that allow crowdfunding within their own state borders. So there are a bunch of states that have done this already. All told, there are laws passed or efforts underway in at least 17 states. Now they all vary, but they generally are much more streamlined and less expensive than the Jobs Act. So therefore, I think are a really good option for community-oriented businesses. So crowdfunding is one of those disruptive technologies that comes along every so often and really threatens to shake up the status quo. But as much as it does threaten to cut out the middlemen, like banks and venture capitalists, it also has the potential to act as the glue that can really bind together a local financial ecosystem. So crowdfunding can really work hand in hand with other funding sources and act as a multiplier. In a way, it's really like a form of due diligence that can validate an idea or demand for a product, kind of like that Pebble watch example. So you can imagine money raised from the community through crowdfunding working together with institutional capital to help a business secure a bank loan, or to close a funding gap, or to give an angel investor that extra boost of confidence she needs to back a startup. Or maybe a corporation or a foundation or a government agency would offer to match funds raised through crowdfunding. So we're already starting to see some of these partnerships and collaborations happen. I'll give just one example. There's a rewards-based crowdfunding platform in New York called Small Knot, and they have a partnership with Axiom, a big microlender. So companies that raise money on Small Knot can take that money and put it towards unlocking a bigger loan from Axiom. So it's almost like they're crowdfunding their collateral. And there's one more point I want to make about crowdfunding, and that's that it's about so much more than just finance. It's also about marketing and branding and civic pride. So in addition to encouraging people to buy local, we can also start encouraging them to invest local. So before I wrap up, I just want to touch on the issue of liquidity, right? Because we're talking about private shares here. So how do you get your money back if you need it? And that's where the concept of the local stock exchange comes in. Well, a lot of people don't realize that we used to have dozens of local stock markets across the country. In Wheeling, West Virginia, Boulder, Colorado, Buffalo, New York, Honolulu, Hawaii, they were everywhere. And what they did was bring together local capital and local enterprises, and they really fueled their regional economies. So what happened? Well, advances in communication technology kind of chipped away at their competitive edge, and one by one, they merged or closed. So where does that leave us today? Our markets are global and efficient, but they're no longer serving those kinds of promising regional and local growth companies that they once did. So there are efforts to bring back local stock exchanges across the U.S. The most interesting one is in Michigan. So following on the heels of their state crowdfunding law, which was passed late last year, their lawmakers have introduced a bill that would allow the creation of a Michigan local stock exchange. So we'll see what happens with that. But someday, local exchanges could be a key part of that local financial ecosystem. Now, trading may be slow on these local markets, even boring, without the kind of volatility that lets traders make a killing. But then I think that's exactly the point. I'm almost finished reading Flash Boys today, and I highly recommend it. So I hope you found some of this inspiring, but you may be wondering, sure, that's great, but can local investing really make a difference? I mean, if I invest in, my local cooperative or a startup, is it really going to change anything? Well, consider that collectively, we Americans have $30 trillion in long-term investments. So 401ks, IRAs, pension funds, and the like. And almost all of that is invested in the stocks and bonds of large global corporations, almost by default, because we have nowhere else to invest it. So if we shift even a small portion of that, 10%, 5%, even 1%, that would have a huge impact. 1% there we go. Okay. 1% of $30 trillion is $300 billion. And just to put that in perspective, that's equal to all of the bank loans outstanding to small businesses today, and about 10 times the amount of venture capital invested annually. So imagine $300 billion for the Main Street economy, and $300 billion for cooperatives and all of these businesses that are currently left out of the financial system. And this is not a political issue. It's not left or right. It's just a very pragmatic view of how to rebuild the economy. So I think this is how it happens, one community at a time. And it starts with each and every one of us. Thank you.